All right, today is June 17th. Here on the Junto Podcast Club. I am Dan Van Gordon.
And my name is Brett McNeil. And today we are joined by a very dynamic guest who has a wide span of interests and disciplines that he has been involved in. His name is Howard Bloom. If you aren't familiar with Howard Bloom, you really should be. Howard Bloom has worked with probably many of the recording artists that you have listened to as a publicist in the music industry, I believe working for Columbia Records at the time.
I founded the biggest PR firm in the record industry. I worked for the Howard Bloom Organization, Ltd.
I stand corrected. I misspoke. But you have worked with people such as Billy Joe, Michael Jackson, Bob Marley, Earth, Wind & Fire, and the list just seems to keep going on. Is that right?
Yeah, Prince, Michael Jackson. You got Bob Marley in there, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, ZZ Top, Joan Jett, etc.
Wow.
Run DMC, the whole rap movement. Yeah. Little things like that.
You know, that's really interesting because that's not really originally what you started in. You started in the more scientific field, or at least that's where your pursuits seem to be. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, that's really my life, is my science. I started at the age of 10 in theoretical physics and microbiology, and then at the age of 12, strange things started to happen. I co-designed my first computer, and it won some science awards, and in those days computers were the size of a house. And I built my first Boolean algebra machine. Boolean algebra is a form of symbolic logic that you may have caught a glimpse of in putting together Boolean searches on Google with ands and ors and stuff like that. And I had my first and only meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, my hometown university, which I strongly suspect he was doing only to do my mother a favor, and I strongly suspect he was planning on 5 minutes at most, because what head of a graduate physics department wants to talk to a 12-year-old? And we ended up in his office for over an hour, and he came out glowing, and he told my mom, you don't have to save for grad school for him. He'll get graduate fellowships in any school he wants in the country, and then and it was because we were talking about the interpretation of the Doppler shift, which was a big deal in 1954. It was the hottest topic in science because that was the year when steady-state theory was batting its head up against Big Bang theory, and Fred Hoyle, the guy behind steady-state theory, was absolutely convinced that within months he would deep six Big Bang theory, which is George Gamlove's theory, and that it would never be heard of again. And as you noticed, you've never heard of Big Bang Theory, right? So Fred Hoyle was wrong, but it was the hottest topic of the time. And when I was 6, so that was all while I was 12. And when I was 16, I was working at the world's largest cancer research lab, and I'm basically playing hooky because I was supposed to be doing or helping in advanced research on immunology, and instead I tried to solve what's called the CPT problem, the charge, parity, and time problem.
Okay.
And in the process of batting my head up against it for 2.5 months in the cafeteria over lunch with a bunch of other people, I came up with a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe that predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for 38 years. It's called dark energy. And if you go online and you look up Howard Bloom Big Bang or Howard Bloom Big Bagel, you'll find the theory explained very, very simply in a 5-minute animation that's had 799,000 hits so far.
Well,
yes, my background was absolutely, completely, totally 100% in science.
Well, I find it very interesting because I believe that you said that you were reading a book on Einstein, and you said that if you weren't able to condense the theory that you were trying to convey, it did no good.
Well, Einstein, there's something really weird happened to me when I was 12. One of the girls in my class turned her eyes to me, and I didn't realize this, Brett, at the time, but nobody had ever done that before, and it was startling. And she said, I told my mom, you understand the theory of relativity. And in those days, it was said that only 7 people in the world understood the theory of relativity. But I didn't dare confess that I didn't know the theory of relativity, because the only thing going for me, the kids hated me. They didn't want to have anything to do with me, but they called me the sickly scientist, which was a sort of backhanded compliment to my scientific engagement. So if I explained that I didn't understand the theory of relativity, I was going to be seriously humiliated on the only thing I had going for me. So I got on my bicycle as soon as school was out. I pedaled to the local library, this little white building shaded by these enormous 7-story high trees, and went in, and the librarians literally knew me better than my mom. Mm-hmm. And I said, give me everything you've got on relativity, and they gave me a great big fat book and a little skinny book. And I took the 2 books home and started reading as quickly as possible. And I have a very peculiar habit of, if I'm given a hard way to do something and an easy way to do something, I will often take the hard way. So I started with the great big fat book, which turned out to have nothing but equations on the pages and only about 13 words of English on any page. And I'd made it up to page 50, and then I looked at the clock. It was 8 o'clock at night, and there was no way in hell I was going to get through that book by the time my mom put me to sleep. So I was in desperate trouble. I turned to the little skinny book, and I was very lucky that all this happened, because in the introduction to that little skinny book, which is written by Albert Einstein, both books were Einstein, Einstein reached out through the pages. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but once in a while it feels like the writer is reaching out through the pages, grabbing you by the lapel, putting his nose up to yours, and delivering a personal message.
Yeah.
And basically Einstein said to me, schmuck, wake up. You want to be a genius? It's not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory. Then you have to be able to express it so clearly that anybody with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. So when I was 12 years old, Albert Einstein, through the pages of a book we never met, told me, schmuck, listen up. You want to be an original scientific thinker? You've got to be a writer, and not just any writer. You've got to be a really, really delicious writer.
I couldn't agree more. And, I mean, when I was reading How I Accidentally Started the 60s, you did just that, and I felt like I was there a lot of the times. Now, let's rewinding back here a little bit in your more formative years. You said at that point you started to reconcile the religion question, and it happened with your parents on the way to church. Tell me more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, let me give you something that I've never said out loud because I haven't had the opportunity, but a few weeks ago, a friend was in a play put on by Brian Greene, the physicist,
right,
theoretical physicist. And Brian Greene wrote it, Brian Greene starred in it, and it's about Einstein. And one of the things it brings to the fore is that Einstein regarded as he had to reconcile one thing to the rest of everything we know in science. And it was that the speed of time does not seem to change, that it's inflexible. Mm-hmm. And it was his obsession with that led to the theory of relativity. Well, my similar obsession was with the ecstatic experience in religion. So the tale you're talking about is I was 12 years old. My bar mitzvah was coming up. Kids did not like me in Buffalo, New York. It was the first party I was ever going to be invited to. And I didn't want to give up the presents. You know, you get a ton of presents and checks.
Yeah. I don't blame you.
And I suddenly realized I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I believe in the first 2 rules of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before. That's my religion. But I couldn't admit it to myself, because if I admitted it, then I'd blow the bar mitzvah. So I waited until the bar mitzvah was over and kept this realization in a tiny little corner of my mind where I didn't have to confess to it. And the day after the bar mitzvah, or actually 2 months later, when I'd signed when I'd written all the thank you cards and deposited all the checks, then I was able to confess that I was an atheist. Well, that was in August. Mm-hmm. And something weird comes up in September, the month after August. It's called the High Holiday Services in the Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. my parents didn't really care about what I believed most of the time, but to them, the high holiday services were absolutely sacred. So they somehow got me into a suit, which I don't have any idea of how they did because I hate suits, and they got me into their car, and they got me all the way to Richmond Avenue, this big tree-lined street where the synagogue was, and they couldn't get me any further. I held on to the door frame with both hands while my parents were pulling at my ankles, shredding my socks, literally trying to drag me to the synagogue, and I wouldn't go. And I had a moment of insight. Think about this. Galileo made his huge advances, in part by taking a relatively newfangled gadget, the lens. And instead of looking at the horizon, which is what a spyglass was invented for, and it had just been invented, he had made a knockoff copy. It was a top-secret weapons-grade thing that the Dutch had made for their war with the Habsburg family in Spain. So Galileo had this bizarre idea. You've got this device with two lenses that's designed to look at the horizon and let you know that the troops of the Duke of Orange are coming at you long before he knows that you've seen him. Why not try to turn it up to the heavens? Well, this was a sacrilegious idea and a crazy idea from the point of view of science. Everybody involved in science could tell you exactly what you'd see in the heavens. Aristotle had mapped it out. It was perfect circles. Ptolemy and 100 AD had mapped it out even further. And and it was blasphemous to look at the heavens. It's like looking up God's skirt at his underwear, for God's sake. I mean, that's God's living room rug.
Yeah.
And you're trying to catch a peek of it when you already know exactly what's going to be there. Well, hell, that's not what Galileo discovered. He discovered that he saw objects that were pockmarked like the moon and that looked to him like stones in the sky. So Galileo's big insight came from taking his perceptual device and turning it in an unexpected direction. And there was another guy, the inventor of the microscope, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and his innovation was to take that device that was designed for horizontal viewing. He used it. He was a draper. So he used it to examine the cloths that he was importing to see how regular the weave was. And his big idea was, instead of horizontal viewing, take this thing and point it down. So he pointed it down at pond water, and he saw, lo and behold, animalcules, little independent organisms, flitting and skidding around. He even had the audacity to look at fresh human sperm and discovered more animalcules, and had the further audacity to write a letter about it to the Royal Society, which is the equivalent of confessing that you masturbated, to the Royal Society of Britain.
Yeah.
So these two great innovations from two men that I admired at the age of 12 came from turning the lens in an unaccustomed direction. So there I was, holding on to the door frame of my parents' blue Fraser, a kind of car they haven't made in a zillion years, and they're tugging at my socks, and I suddenly realized there are no gods in the heaven. I mean, how do I know that? I'm an atheist. There are no gods underneath the ground, but there are gods in the scene. Where the hell are they? They're in my parents. They're in my parents' believing so passionately in a God that they are threatening to remove my feet in order to get me to a synagogue. And if they're in my parents, then they're in me. So my task became to use my scientific tools to find the gods inside of us.
Well, as fervent as they were, and we talk about customs and the family unit back then, weren't you afraid as a kid, with the stigma of proclaiming to be an atheist? Did that kind of take you aback a little bit, or how did you?
Not really. Remember, I was a reject already. There was nothing more you could reject me for. I mean, aside from boiling me in oil or burning me at the stake or something like that. And I grew up in an environment of books. I mean, there I was rejected by other kids totally. And when I was 10 years old, I discovered books, and I started reading books, 2 books a day. Now, 12, the difference between 10 years old and 12 years old doesn't sound very big to you and me because we're past the age of 20. Right. But back in those days, when you were 10, the difference between 10 and 12 is huge. Well, so I had read literally a library full of books. I had run out of books at my local library. The one place where I was accepted was the intellectual realm. Why? Because I didn't have to know anybody in person. They didn't get a chance to say no to me. They didn't get a chance to turn up their noses and turn their backs, because most of them were dead, and the few that weren't dead, like Einstein, were never going to meet me. So through books... What's that?
Oh, no, I was going to say that I'm also a fellow atheist, and I've always felt the same way. I think you hit the nail on the head.
Right. So we're part of an intellectual class, and the people we hang out with are dead people like Bertrand Russell, or people who are close to dead like Bertrand Russell, and being an atheist is perfectly acceptable among all the great intellects of the Western world.
Well, I grew up in a Catholic household, and we did some philosophy even in my middle school years. And one of the things that they constantly would drive home to us is Pascal's wager. Are you familiar at all?
Yeah, Pascal's wager. Yeah. I'm sorry, I wasn't interested. Pascal could go bet that there was. Look, I would have felt horrible being anything else but what I was.
Good point.
One of the most important things in life is you don't let people push you around. You don't take up false beliefs. You follow your instincts to the best of your ability and do your best year after year after year to learn how to work with those instincts to make positive results happen.
Couldn't
but
agree
if you
more.
Start shoving aside who you really are, hey, you just cut Samson's hair. You've just removed your connection to the Force, and you cannot afford to do that.
Well, all right.
Yeah.
Dan?
Oh, I was going to say, I would say that, Brett, he talked about stigma, and even though, I feel like there's no stigma of atheists, and I know you said you can't really betray yourself, I do think that there's a level of mistrust people have of you if you don't believe in God.
Well, that may have been true in Wisconsin, but I was growing up in Buffalo, New York, and Buffalo, New York is it's up the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal has one end in New York City and one end in Buffalo, and now to us, New Yorkers, seems like Martians. You could go your whole life without meeting one, but nonetheless, we were a little closer to the East Coast, and it was a population of 7,000 Jews in Buffalo, and for some reason, maybe because I was so weird in so many other ways, nobody ever gave me a hard time about my atheism, except once the bar mitzvah was all over, you go to confirmation class, which is a knockoff of a Catholic thing. And for the first 2 months of the class, I argued with the rabbi about why God didn't exist. Every single week. And finally, the rabbi threw me out of the confirmation class. Well, I was being thrown out of so many other things that it didn't matter.
Yeah.
I was thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence at Morse code. I was thrown out of violin because I mangled the music so badly. I was thrown out of trombone class because the teacher, I don't know why he threw me out. I never heard of a kid being thrown out of an elementary school music class before. He must have thought that I was just too incompetent and too amusical to ever make it in any conceivable way, and he probably felt I was holding back his class. So I was already being stigmatized in so many different areas that even if there had been any stigma to being an atheist, I wouldn't have felt it. But there was none. There was absolutely none. Because, again, like you, Dan, I was floating in the realm of the intellectual greats.
Definitely.
And I think when you're constantly feeling rejected, and I was actually just talking about this with a family member, you find consolement in the pages of books, and you create kind of your own world, and you enter or you enter a different world. And I think that's kind of where that dissident type attitude starts to develop.
Right, and you get proud of what you are. I'm proud of being an atheist. You take that away from me, and you take away my source of strength.
Absolutely. Now, looking a little more past your early years, you became involved in the rock industry. How did that happen?
Well, that was a long and strange passage, boy. So how do we boil it down? I mean, eventually, when I was 16, I started. I thought that there was this group of people in New York City who would accept me if I could ever make contact with them. The first group that had ever accepted me in my life, it was called the Beatniks. And then my dad made a huge mistake, and he took us to Provincetown in Massachusetts for a summer vacation. And it was a mistake because Provincetown, it turns out, was an artist colony. And guess what? It had genuine Beatniks. And I was walking down the street one day, the main street in Provincetown, and saw a gallery, and it looked interesting. I walked in, and I was 16, and there were these bunch of people twice my age, and they were all sitting around having a royal palaver, brainstorming, and I sat down with the group, and I started contributing, and they made me a regular part of the group.
Wow.
So it turned out that, indeed, the Beatniks would accept me. And then, of course, I had to go back to New York. My dad was terrified I was going to be a homosexual. So, and I really was terrified about that. So I got into, because the Beatniks were into Zen Buddhist Satori, I got into Zen Buddhist Satori when I was 16 and started reading up on it. And I wanted to drop out of high school and do a Jack Kerouac and buy a motorcycle and take the motorcycle out to California. But there were several small problems. I didn't have a driver's license. I was the only kid in Buffalo, New York, my age, who did not have a driver's license. For everybody else, it was considered as mandatory as having a right arm. And I didn't know how to ride a motorcycle, and I didn't have enough money for a motorcycle. I mean, aside from those little problems, my parents were terrified, and they got my English teacher, my English literature teacher, to convince me. Well, he came to me with an offer. He said, "Look, you want to drop out of high school? I can get you a job at a lumber camp." Now, the last thing in the world I wanted was to smell armpit odor from a bunch of sweaty men who were nothing like me, with whom I had nothing in common whatsoever. So that stopped me from dropping out of high school. But when I got out to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, which was the Harvard of the West and had the highest median SAT scores of any school in the country, including Harvard and Caltech, I slowly started increasing my search for Zen Buddhist Satori. I was in the top 10% of my class. Only 1 in 10 students could handle a math class at all. It was the only time girls ever paid attention to me because they needed help with their math homework. And then, of course, as soon as I finished helping them with their math homework, they'd go off and date some guy with whom they had a real romantic interest. But so eventually I dropped out, and I accidentally helped start a movement that would get a name a year after I left the United States. The name of the movement that I accidentally helped found was the hippie movement. And so eventually, 3 years later, I decided to take another crack at going to school. And there I was at NYU. Now, I majored in English literature for a reason. I'd spent my whole life in science up to that point. I knew I had my science licked. I did not need academic help in that. But my writing, I'd been working on ferociously since I was 16 years old, but I still did not feel that I had the chops that Albert Einstein had called for. So I went into English literature imagining that they would hold a whip over me and make me write, which is wrong. They didn't. They wanted academic papers on the use of the word yellow in Chaucer. But in my junior year, when I said that my whole life was science when I was a kid, I was overlooking something. From the age of 14 on, poetry had become very important to my life. So I was taking poetry writing classes from the poet in residence at NYU, a guy who would help start a whole bunch of major literary careers. And he said one day, as the class was ending, he said, "Bloom, I want you to wait until everybody leaves the classroom. I want you to sit down in that seat," pointing to the bawling out chair, the chair where you get humiliated by a professor when he has something serious to hit you over the head with. "And I need to talk to you." Okay, so I waited until everybody walked out. I closed the door. I sat with some trepidation in the bawling out seat, And he said, look, last year I asked you to be on the staff of the literary magazine. You never even showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the editor of the literary magazine. Let me put that differently. You are the literary magazine. You don't have a faculty advisor. You don't even have a faculty advisor. It's you. The minute you walk out that door, you are the literary magazine. Now walk out that door. Well, I was baffled and confused and didn't know what to do, and some student in the corridor saw me and said, you look like you're having trouble. Can I help you with something? And I explained with great consternation that I had just been named the editor of the literary magazine, and he said, why don't you come down for a cup of coffee? The difficulty is, Brett and Dan, I had not grown up among other kids. I didn't know standard American rituals. I had no idea of what let's have a cup of coffee means. So I followed him, and he took me to a coffee shop, and I asked for a glass of water, and he asked me one of the most important questions of my life. If you could do anything you wanted to do, what would it be with this magazine? And I said I'd turn it into a picture book. So I turned it into an experimental graphics and literary magazine, and we won 2 National Academy of Poets prizes, and I gathered a staff, an art staff, and meanwhile, I got fellowships, just like the head of the graduate physics department had said. I got fellowships at 4 different universities in what is now called neuroscience. It didn't have a name then. It was called physiological psychology, to the extent that it had a name. But I felt that grad school was going to be Auschwitz for my mind, because here I'd been interested since I was 12 or 13 years old in the gods inside of us. Here I'd been interested in the ecstatic experience and how that relates to the forces of history. And was I going to get anywhere near any kind of ecstatic experience whatsoever, any kind of mass human emotion in grad school? No. In grad school, you give, or once you get out of grad school, you give paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for a psychology credit. And how much ecstatic emotion are you going to see in that classroom? Zero. Absolutely zero. I'd be permanently separated from one of the most important things that I needed to find out about. Again, the ecstatic experience of mass human emotion. So, and my wife, I had gotten married in my freshman year, at the end of my freshman year, to a woman with a 5-year-old kid, and my wife basically said she was tired of having students as husbands. So I was in danger of losing a wife. And, wives are hard to find, at least for me. Maybe they're easier to find for somebody else. Yeah. So I was under the gun. And one day I walked into, it was the summer vacation before grad school at Columbia, which is the fellowship that I accepted. And I walked into the apartment of one of my most brilliant artists. And there was no furniture in the room. And he and his wife and his baby were all on the floor crying. And I asked them what was wrong, and they said, well, our furniture's been repossessed, the electricity is about to be cut off, the phone is about to be cut off, and they're throwing us out of the apartment. And I thought, this guy's fucking brilliant. If I simply took his work to anybody within 2 weeks, I'd have him enough jobs that he could pay his rent and live a decent life. So I figured I'd do this before I started whatever job I was going to get for the summer vacation. And I asked him just to put a portfolio together, and he said, yeah, but if you take my portfolio out, I came with my best friend here from Rhode Island or Boston in order to start an art studio, so you have to take my best friend's work too. I thought his best friend's work was pure shit. It was awful. It was terrible. It wasn't art. But, okay, I said yes. And I started taking the portfolio around, and within 2 weeks, I didn't have any jobs for him whatsoever. And I'm obsessive-compulsive. And when I start something, I like to finish it. So I kept working at it all summer long, and by the end of the summer, I had New York Magazine interested in doing a feature story on our studio, but still, no jobs. And this turned out to be a periscope position into a field I knew absolutely nothing about, popular culture, but in which I could sense that the gods resided, in which I could sense that that there was the vast underbelly in which new myths and movements are made, where the ecstatic experience could possibly be. So I called Columbia and I said, I have a back problem and can't show up this year, and that wasn't true. And you know, my first principle is the truth at any price, including the price of your life. So I shouldn't have said that. But, and I kept trying to sell the art. And eventually the art led me, well, it turns out that ABC owned, you know, the big company behind ABC, the television network, owned 7 radio stations. And those 7 radio stations were about to transition to a new and very, very risky format called progressive radio or rock radio. On traditional radio, you played, if you were a DJ, you played the top 40 hits, and that's it. That's all you played. Yeah. And in the new format, you could play anything you wanted, including playing an entire album from Guzzle to Zatch, if that's what you wanted. And this was a huge risk for a major corporation. And they hired my art studio to do all of the art. And so I would go up there periodically, and the head of promotion would basically school me on this music that I'd never paid any attention to before, rock and roll. And she, among other things, she said, look, we're having a concert here next week. Do you want me to give you 2 tickets? And I said, okay, fine. And I took Peter Bramley, my brilliant artist, the one who had been sitting on the floor with his family crying, and it was a piano player who was on stage, and Peter embarrassed the shit out of me. He stood up, he hollered, he yelled, he whooped, he clapped, he just, I mean, you know, really want embarrassment, try taking Peter Bramley somewhere. Yeah. And then it turns out that the concert was turned into an album, and the piano player was named Elton John, and it's Elton John's live album, and it's called 10/27/1972 or something like that. Classic. And you can hear Peter Bramley in the background, and I realized as a performer, when you're a performer, the more energy you get from the audience, the more energy you put out. And Peter was the one giving the energy to Elton John. So I was accidentally in this field, and eventually my art studio, after 3 years of building the studio up, we got the National Lampoon. We got this new client. A guy named Matty Simmons had helped invent the credit card, and he'd made a fortune working for American Express. And now that he had a fortune, he wanted to be a publisher. So he went up to Boston, and in Boston there's this magazine that a bunch of kids at Harvard put out once a year. It goes on sale at newsstands all over North America, and it sells out in 2 hours. So Matty went to the current crew of this publication and said, look, I'll give you a lot of money. I want you to replant yourselves in New York City, and instead of doing the magazine once a year, do the magazine once a month. And they said yes. The magazine, the Harvard magazine was called The Lampoon. So Matty Simmons' new magazine was called The National Lampoon.
Oh, okay.
And Matty gave my studio the job of art directing The National Lampoon.
Very cool.
Well, remember the artist that Peter Bramley made me accept, whose work I found utterly incompetent? He took over. He kidnapped The National Lampoon. And in order to do it, he had the other artists vote me out of my studio. Now, half of my artists left with me, and I tried to start a new studio. But the fact is that I'd been following Einstein's imperative, that Einstein said, write, you fucking bastard, and write accessibly. And to me, writing accessibly meant breaking into magazines. I'd already written and edited for the head of the Middlesex County Mental Health Clinic in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and I had written and edited for, of all people, the Boy Scouts of America during one of my summer vacations, which is really weird when you consider that I'd been thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence at Morse code, and if they'd wanted to, they could have thrown me out for incompetence at knot tying, or just about anything else aside from speaking and writing the English language. I had become a contributing editor to 2 magazines, an underground fashion magazine called Rags that was put together by Baron Wolman, who had helped co-found Rolling Stone, and another magazine called Natural Lifestyles. And this meant getting up at 6 in the morning, going directly to the typewriter, typing for 2 hours, going into the art studio, doing my day job at the art studio, and then coming back home at night and typing until 11 o'clock, and it was getting exhausting.
And how old were you at the time?
By then I was 26 1986 or something like that.
Okay.
I graduated from NYU. Maybe older than that. I'm not sure. So at any rate, no, let me do the arithmetic. I was 28. So this was getting wearing. One day I was covering a parapsychology convention of all things, mind readers and people who bend spoons with their willpower and stuff like that. And somebody walked up to me. He saw that I was holding a notepad and that I was taking a lot of notes. And he said, "Would you like to edit a magazine?" And I didn't care what the magazine was because, look, if I could write for the Boy Scouts and could write their handbooks on stalking and tracking and camouflage, and if I could write their book on how to create new Boy Scout troops in towns that had never had one before, 10 Steps to Organize a Boy Scout Troop, I wrote those things wanting you, if you followed the instructions in my booklet, to be able to get so close to a bunny rabbit that the rabbit didn't even know you were there until you were rubbing noses. I wanted you to succeed. And through caring about you, through loving you, and through doing tons of research, I was able to write about things that I could never actually do. I mean, I can't find my way into the forest, much less out of the forest. So I figured I could write about anything, and I didn't ask what the magazine was about. And I went to a meeting with the publisher, and in those days, we did not have Google. And that meant you couldn't simply look the publisher's name up and see what magazine he published. There was no way to find out. So I went to the meeting, and it turned out the magazine was called Circus, but it wasn't about elephants and clowns. It was about rock and roll. And I had gotten a little basic schooling in rock and roll from the people at ABC's FM stations, and now I became a Talmudic scholar of rock and roll. I mean, I just started reading everything I possibly could, and I increased the circulation of the magazine 211% in 2 years. And according to Chet Flippo, who founded Rolling Stone's East Coast office, I created a new magazine genre. He said this in his master's thesis, A History of Rock Journalism. He said, I created a new magazine genre, the heavy metal magazine. And then I founded a PR firm, and it became the biggest PR firm in the music industry. So that's a story that makes no sense whatsoever, but it's how I accidentally landed in rock and roll. And when I went to my first Fleetwood Mac concert, I suddenly realized I was in the land where the gods are. I was in the lands where ecstatic ritual is a par for the course, where the artist on stage goes through ecstasies, where the audience is lifted out of itself. It's called getting off. The audience is just, you start with an audience of 3,000 people who feel very individuated, and they're very conscious of what the people on either side of them and the people behind them are thinking, and they want to look cool. And then the lights go down on the audience, and the lights come up on the stage. And after 15 or 20 minutes of a successful concert, all those people in the audience, they've lost their envelopes of individuation. They have merged into a giant amoebic form. And it's a giant amoebic form that sends out a tunnel. It sends out a pseudopod to the person on stage. And there becomes this reverberatory circuit. The audience is driven to ecstasy by the performer, and the performer is driven to ecstasy by the audience. And I had experienced this. I knew exactly what was going on because when I was 16 years old, after doing things like tracking down the book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience by William James, which I did when I was 14, and really going after, in an academic sense, the ecstatic experience, when I was 16, I'd finally had the ecstatic experience. I was 16 years old. The kids hated me in my high school, but they had these functional committees that had to accomplish things. And the kids who were popular were very happy being president and vice president and treasurer and never doing a thing, never lifting a finger, just getting validation for their popularity. But when it came to these functional committees, they had to elect somebody who'd actually do something. So I was named the head of the program committee for 2 years in a row. And the program committee, every day there was a student assembly, 5 days a week. And that meant I emceed those student assemblies, and I programmed 2 of them a week. So one day, the juniors came to me, and they said, we're having a dance. Could you advertise it for us? And they didn't realize the irony of this request. The fact is that if they were having a dance anywhere in Buffalo, New York, at all, They wanted me as far away as possible, preferably Cleveland or Tucson, Arizona, because I was incompetent at dancing.
I'm as flat-footed as you are. I get it.
Nonetheless, I went on stage. I put a piece of music on a turntable, and I started dancing the way I'd never danced before, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I can't do the box step. I can't do the foxtrot. I can't do the waltz. So what I was doing was moving, interpreting the music with my shoulders, with my arms, with my fingertips, with my face, with my entire body, and in a way no one had ever seen before, and if you've never seen it, you've never seen it either. I looked like a Looney Tune drawn on LSD. And as I danced, I saw the faces of the audience melting. I saw their pupils dilating. I felt them come together as one big amoebic mass. I felt that pseudopod reach out to me. I had an out-of-body experience. I literally saw myself as being on the ceiling and watching all of this take place beneath me. And for 4 minutes, the energy of that audience came pouring through me. Somewhere around my head, it got utterly transmogrified into something radically different and was sent back out to the audience. And it was this giant reverberatory circuit, this giant feedback loop. Yeah. It was astonishing. So I knew what Mick Fleetwood was going through at his best. Mm-hmm. I knew what that audience was going through. I knew I finally had that ecstatic experience as a reference point. And the strange thing happened with the Fleetwood Mac concert. The power went out on the stage, totally. There was no sound and no lights. And the power went up in the audience. Well, that's a great way to dissipate that sense of losing yourself that makes being at a concert so special. So, But Mick Fleetwood came to the edge of the stage. He was this big, tall string bean of a man, very thin, and he raised his fist in the air, and he said, "Fuck the electricity, we're going to rock and roll." He galvanized that audience. And that kind of experience that I'm talking about with an audience is a bonding experience.
Oh, yeah.
And he brought that bond between the members of the audience up to an even higher level than it could have been at if it was just a normal concert. Because we were all enduring a hardship together.
Sure.
And it brought us together in a very peculiar way. And the concert was all the richer as an ecstatic experience because of the obstacle in the path. So suddenly I realized, hey, by total accident, here I've been hunting the gods inside of us all my life, or at least since I was 13, and I've just by accident landed in the place where the gods are. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of an answer to your question.
Sure. It's fascinating because you've really got through your works, you've really got a grasp on, the human element and human nature, if you will. And I believe it was in Rogan that you were talking about kind of shadowing or following an artist for a week or so. And,
right.
Watching how they lived and kind of how they were in their element. Who did you really enjoy, and any anecdotes that you have from some of those experiences?
The greatest experience of all was working with Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson was unlike any other human I've ever met on planet Earth, and any other that I probably will ever meet. And This is despite being friends with Buzz Aldrin and getting support from the sixth man on the moon, Edgar Mitchell, and knowing all kinds, being supported. I have a project going right now with a 4-star general in the Air Force. And so I've had the weird privilege of having access to all kinds of pretty damned amazing people. Mm-hmm. But nothing has ever come close to Michael Jackson. Yeah. He had a quality of awe and wonder and commitment to his audience, commitment to his kids, I have never seen and I never imagined could exist. So one of my tasks, Michael has set a new standard for awe, wonder, and commitment. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows it because people have been their minds have been so sullied by all of these sexual allegations that they're tossing aside. They're tossing aside a guy who sets a whole new standard for humankind. What do I mean by a whole new standard for humankind? Well, once upon a time, in 1953 or so, no one had ever broken a 4-minute mile. And the physiologists and experts would tell you nobody possibly could break a 4-minute mile. And then this guy named Roger Bannister got a little tiny team together, and they analyzed every single running step that he took in order to figure out how to maximize its efficiency. And finally, Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. Well, everybody thought that couldn't possibly be done for 1,000 years or 2,000 years, and now it had been done once. And once it was done once, that expanded the possibilities of humanity. Mm-hmm. What do I mean? One person after another broke the 4-minute mile. And if you look at Wikipedia will tell you that any decent runner now breaks the 4-minute mile. It's just automatic. So some people come along like Roger Bannister, and they expand the boundaries of possibility for all of humanity. Michael did that, but nobody knows he did that yet because he's been so sullied by all of this sexual crap. And I have a book coming up in April of 2020 called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul and the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. And it's about this story, and Michael is the most important person in it because, frankly, Michael was the most important person in my life. You know, I do a radio show called Coast to Coast. It's the highest-rated overnight talk radio show in North America, and I've done it 294 times so far. Mm-hmm. I'm on basically 4 times a month or 5 times a month. And for the first few years, my producer had to come to me and say, Howard, could you please stop talking about Michael Jackson? Because I was so floored by him. I was so addicted to the possibilities that he had opened up for you, for me, for Dan, that I could not stop talking about him. And in this book, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, hopefully I get across who Michael really was, what he really was, in a way that you can grok with your gut, that you can understand and comprehend with your gut, so that you never lose track of it again, so that it does push the envelope of human possibility.
Yeah, I mean, he really was larger than life, and on all levels, too, and everything that he did, and was a true pioneer in his field. Now, what did your interactions look like with him?
Well, the first time I ever met him, I'd been hired by his brothers, and I went, this story is in Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, but for 4 months, the Jacksons' manager was calling me and asking me to work with the Jacksons. And I don't like to do things that are automatics. I like to do things that really need me. I like to do crusades. I like to do unpopular groups who really merit a radically different perception. So I said no. And then finally he called and he said, we're going to be in New York this weekend and the Jacksons want to meet you. Well, look, I don't know human rituals. Remember the cup of coffee? I didn't understand. But I had heard that to be a mensch, to be a real man, if you want to say no to somebody, you say it to their face. Mm-hmm. So I accepted the meeting. So I went into the Helmsley Palace Hotel at midnight on a Saturday, and Saturdays and Sundays were my 2 hardest working days of the week because I could take home all the paperwork on all of my campaigns, and the phone wouldn't ring, and I could concentrate and see where those campaigns stood and where they needed to go next. Mm-hmm. So doing a midnight meeting on a Saturday was very hard. But I went in to say no. And the minute the door opened, through a 2-inch opening, I caught a glimpse of these guys and realized they were in serious trouble. I didn't know what the trouble was, but they were in serious trouble. Mm-hmm. I realized this is all in an instant. I realized these are 4 of the most decent guys I've ever seen in my life, and something is very wrong. Well, if something's very wrong, you do need me. I will say yes. Mm-hmm. And I said yes. So 3 or 4 months later, I was with Marlon Jackson at his pool house. I was with all the brothers. Mm-hmm. And a pool house is a little building with a little room on the first floor and another little room on the second floor. Mm-hmm. And the little room, in this case, on the first floor, had a billiard table in the middle, pretty much crowding out the room, and these giant arcade video game machines around the periphery of the room, up against the walls. These machines, I mean, no human could afford these machines at the time. It took owning an arcade to be able to own one. So we were standing at the billiard table and looking at merchandising stuff, and the brothers had a lot of confidence in me, bless their souls. So they listened when I said things about maintaining the quality of things so that the items, the tour items, the merchandising items reflected the quality of the Jacksons themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then the screen door opened, and I had been taught a ritual. Again, I grew up with lab rats and guinea pigs and guppies, and they don't have the kind of social rituals that we do. So there was another ritual I had been taught, which is if you see a person that somebody wants you to meet, you walk up to them, you put your hand out, they shake hands, you shake hands, and you say, "Hi, I'm Howard," and then they're required to say, "Hi, I'm whoever you are." So I had never really done it before, but when the screen door opened, I walked over and I put up my hand and I said, "Hi, I'm Howard," and the person coming through the screen door reached out his hand and said, "Hi, I'm Michael." And he said it in a very normal voice, and he had a softer handshake than the guys who try to crush your hand to demonstrate how macho they are. He certainly didn't do that, but it was a very normal handshake. And I told him that I had a press release I wanted to get his okay on, and we went upstairs. And upstairs, the second floor, was just a jumble of amplifiers and keyboards. There was scarcely any room in which to walk. So Michael sat on one amplifier, and I sat on another amplifier, and I read him the press release. And as I did, Michael's body softened and slumped. He sort of slid down in position until he was almost horizontal. And he was going, oh. And he said, when I finished, "That's beautiful. Did you write that?" Well, of course I had. And the fact is that I did not regard a press release as a hack item, not by any stretch of the imagination. I'd been practicing the art of writing since I was 14 years old, and I was pretty damned obsessive about it. And all of that art that went into putting together a magazine that won 2 National Academy of Poets prizes, all of that was in a simple press release. And no one had ever seen it before. And Michael did. So that's, and then we went downstairs, and there was a meeting scheduled with an art director from Columbia Records. And she walked in the door, and she had 5 of the most gorgeous portfolios you've ever seen, carved cherry wood, carved leather, custom-made things. And remember, I had carried a portfolio for 3 years with the art studio, so I knew this routine, except my portfolio had been black vinyl. And these turned out to be from the artists that were at the top of the field, people that I and my artists admired tremendously. And she splayed these things out across the billiard table, and Michael started to open one of the portfolios, and as he just opened a square inch of the first picture, I was standing directly to his left. My right elbow and his right elbow were in contact. His left knee and my right knee were right next to each other. And Michael's body, again, his knees bent. And he said, "Ooh." And from that ooh, you could hear that Michael was seeing more in that 1 square inch of picture than the artist imagined was in the entire picture, or maybe in the entire portfolio. Michael was seeing the infinite in the tiniest of things. It was amazing. And Michael opened another couple of square inches, and his knees buckled even further. And he went, "Ooh." And then further, "Ooh." You could hear Michael and feel him through your own elbow and your knee, having an aesthetic orgasm. Now, William Blake talked about seeing the infinite in the tiniest of things, seeing eternity in a flower and heaven in an... I don't remember the lines exactly, but it was very grabbing, and for me it was a personal mandate. Well, I had never seen it come alive, seeing the infinite in the tiniest of things, the way it came alive in Michael. In fact, I'd never seen anything close to it, and I never would see it again. It was my only glimpse into that land of infinite awe that was Michael's soul.
Now I know
so
that.
That's what,
I'm sorry.
Oh, wait. Oh.
Well, I was going to say, I know during that time, the Jacksons had kind of ran into a bit of a rut, right? I mean, they weren't as sought at as before, and I think this is before Off the Wall had came. Was that around those years, or
no? It was the Victory Tour.
The Victory Tour,
and it was after Off the Wall.
Okay,
and it was when Michael was at his peak. He had just sold 36 million albums in a year. Nobody had ever come close to that. Not the Beatles, not Elvis Presley, nobody.
What happened with that Don King thing around that time?
Yeah, it was the Don King thing. Don, when I sensed the trouble in the room back at the Helmsley Palace Hotel, all of a sudden I started to realize that the clues had been in front of me all along. Don King had made the tour announcement at the Tavern on the Green, and Don King has killed somebody. Don King is a murderer.
Yeah.
He stomped a man to death. Can you imagine that? Flooring a guy and then kicking his head until he's dead. That's what Don King had done over a $600 gambling loan.
Wow.
So
that's crazy.
Yeah, so putting Don King, with Don King hogged the podium at the announcement at the Tavern on the Green, as if it was a Don King tour, not a Jackson tour. And because of his shady background, I mean, the guy's brilliant. There's no question about it. He revived boxing, which was a dead sport, and he turned it into theater, which was an astonishment. But you have to give him credit for that. But the fact is he was a shady character, and he was overshadowing the Jacksons, and his values did not represent the values of the Jacksons at all, not one bit. So his mere presence was sullying the tour. And then somebody leaked what it said were contracts with some of the people vying to be the promoters of the tour. And they were leaking it along with the narrative that the Jacksons were has-beens and that they had this expensive quality of life and that they needed to make money in order to sustain it, and they were vampires sucking the blood from their brother. Ticket prices were going to be $30. Average ticket prices in those days were $11.50. And the high ticket price was because the Jackson family was trying to, again, suck the money out of the audience for all they were worth. It was their last shot, according to the narrative that was handed along with these so-called secret contracts. Well, the fact is, if you go into a negotiation and you absolutely love the person you're negotiating with, and you really want to work together, and then you turn the whole project over to your attorney to write a contract, the contract, it reads like a vicious, monstrous document. Attorneys are in the habit of writing confrontational documents and treating your potential partner, as if that potential partner is a potential thief. So what you do is you shudder when you see the contracts and you rewrite them. You make your lawyer rewrite them so that they represent a fair and honest agreement. Well, the Jacksons were doing that with these contracts, but whoever got their hands on the contracts must have gotten the versions the lawyers had put together before the Jacksons had made any changes. Plus, somebody was out to get the Jacksons. And who is out to get the Jacksons? The mystery of that is in Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. Because I didn't realize it, and it took me years to articulate it. The reason I'd said yes to the Jacksons is they hired me to save their brother's soul, and I failed. It was one of the few things on which I failed in my career.
Dan?
And, you did talk a lot about your time with the Stars. I was kind of wondering, because I remember in the beginning of your book, Lucifer's Principle, I believe it's
right,
Principle.
The Lucifer Principle.
Yeah. You did talk about how that time with those stars kind of helped shape your understanding of basically humanity. And I was kind of wondering, you were talking about for a second in previous conversation about how people in a crowd were acting as one, and it made me think of the superorganism that you talked about in the Lucifer's Principle. And I just kind of want to go there and kind of talk about, how we interact as one body, one organism. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we operate as arms, legs, fingers, knees of a social body, and we do that with many social bodies. We do it with the subculture we're a part of. We do it with the nation that we're a part of. We do it with the civilization we're a part of. We do it with the people with whom we share a common philosophy, and we get together in groups based on our similarities. And then we begin to demonstrate our differences. And why do we demonstrate our differences within a group? We want to accept us because we have to differentiate and do different functions. Some people are good at writing. Some people are good at speaking. Some people are good at knocking on doors. Some people are good at doing paperwork in the background or accounting. And we need to differentiate ourselves so that we can do the different functions of the social groups of which we're a part. And the analogy is you are 100 trillion cells. 90 trillion of those cells don't even bother to call themselves you. They're bacterial colonies living inside of you, doing vital functions for you, churning out your vitamin B, churning out your vitamin K, digesting your food for you and turning it into glucose so that you can absorb it. But yet you still claim to be Dan, even though you're 100 trillion potentially independent cells. And you still claim to be Brett, despite being this agglomeration of independent cells. Well, a social group is like that agglomeration of cells. If you asked a single cell its name, it would not say Dan. It would not say Brett. It has no idea of what this emergent property of a self is all about. And yet there's this emergent property of a self, and it's so vital that you introduce yourself as Dan or Brett. You don't introduce yourself as, hi, I'm 100 trillion cells. They all say hello. So in the same way, we are cells in a social body. And the proof of that is we are told that we are built with a survival instinct. And that survival instinct reigns above all things most of the time. And we are told that we are selfish animals and we are out for personal self-interest. The idea of personal self-interest underlies all of economics and a lot of the other social sciences. And none of that is true. Because think back to when you were in college and you were taking a math test. You studied for weeks, you sat down in front of that test paper, and all of a sudden your mind went blank. Now, your mind going blank is something your body does to you. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside of you. Now, if you have a survival instinct, why would your mind go blank under pressure? Or your girlfriend leaves you, and you are in a state of intense pain. Romantic pain is one of the worst pains in the world.
Yeah.
And you are also in a state of profound depression. And some days you don't feel like even putting your socks on in the morning. You have a hard time getting the motivation to do that. Well, what is doing this to you? What is creating that sense of internal pain? What is creating that sense of depression? What is demotivating you so much that you can barely put your clothes on in the morning? All things inside of you. If you had if you had only survival instincts, how could these self-destruct mechanisms built into your biology possibly work? Why would they be there? Well, they're there for a simple reason. You are not built for personal survival. Yes, you have a survival instinct. Yes, you are partially built for survival. But you are built even more for the survival of the group.
Yeah.
Now, and you are built as a neuron in a collective brain. Now, what does that mean? In a neural system, let's take neural nets, the currently popular forms of generating artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence works by rewarding nodes in the system that can handle the challenge of the moment, and by taking resources away from the nodes in the system that aren't contributing or that are taking you in the wrong direction. What is taking things away and giving things to different batches of circuitry mean? It means that the circuits that are useful in solving the problem of the moment get more electricity, and they get more influence. They get connections to more and more of the other nodes in the system. Whereas those that are not contributing to the problem of the moment, their electrical supply gets shut down to just about zero, and their connections to others, their influence, is radically decreased. We are built the same way. Our self-destruct mechanisms, when we don't feel we have a handle on things, they take us out of the action. They make us irrelevant. They make us look for things, other people who are succeeding, to whom we can attach ourselves. And they lead to those who are succeeding, those who are successfully confronting the problems of the moment, those who have a handle on things, those who have a bit of control over things. Those people develop followers and become popular. And something else strange happens. I remember being out on Sunset Boulevard one day, outdoors at a restaurant, with a friend who would later be the head of Madonna's record company, and with Ken Cragen, who was one of the most successful and amazing managers in the business. And I was due to be at Bette Midler's house at 3 in the afternoon. And these people were encouraging me to go to a local shop and buy a little $300 sweater for Bette's kid. Well, if I had $300 to allocate, who should I be giving it to, Bette Midler or a homeless person?
Mm.
That doesn't need it.
Right.
The homeless person does. And yet the impulse is to take presents to Bette Midler. That's resource agglomeration. And the resources go to those who are most successful. Mm-hmm. It's a basic part of a learning machine. It's called a Darwinian algorithm in AI terms. And we are built to be elements in Darwinian. We were built with Darwinian algorithms. We are built so that when we feel a sense of control over things, we attract other people, we increase our influence, and more people give us more things. But when we feel that we have no control over our lives, the amount of resources we're allowed to tap diminish severely, and we send out negative cues, negative social cues, repulsion cues to others instead of attraction cues. So we lose our influence. And eventually, well, here's how bees handle this kind of thing. Imagine that you're in a bee hive, and there's a hot flower patch of the day, and you're a normal worker. So you wait to sense where all the other normal workers are going, and then you follow them. Mm-hmm. And you get to the flower patch, and you stock up with these little carrying baskets on your hind legs. You stock up with pollen and nectar, and then you head back for the hive. And at the hive, there's an unloading dock, and there are unloader bees. And if they see that you were carrying pollen and nectar at a time when the interior of the hive really needs pollen and nectar, they rush over to you and treat you like a rock star. They feel you all over with their antennae and their 4 legs, and they unload your cargo of nectar and honey. They make you nectar and pollen. They make you feel like a superstar, and you go out with huge confidence and energy to get another load from the hot flower patch of the day. But eventually, the hot flower patch of the day begins to run out of pollen and nectar. Mm-hmm. So when you come home, there's almost nothing in your carrying baskets. There's almost no nectar in your public stomach. You have 2 stomachs. One is a stomach that allows you to share things with other bees. And normally the unloader bees stick their tongues down to your public stomach. And if you're carrying a lot of nectar, and nectar is what's needed in the hive, they get all enthusiastic and suck it out of you. So, but now you've got no nectar in your public stomach. You've got no pollen in the carrying baskets on your thighs. These are carrying hairs, basically. So the unloader bees check you out very quickly, and then they turn their backs on you. They are cutting. And what does this do to you? I mean, you keep going back to the hive. You can't believe the old plant and your job there has disappeared. You keep going back and forth to the old flower patch, and you get less and less pollen and nectar each time you go. And finally, it takes a long time, you get discouraged, mm-hmm. and you crawl into the hive. You don't walk upright, with your legs standing tall into the hive the way that you did when you were the hot cargo carrier of the moment. You crawl and you beg for food. And you're what Tom Seeley, the leading expert on this, calls an unemployed bee. So what do you do to get yourself out of this state of depression and lethargy? Because your self-destruct mechanisms have just taken you over. You, as a bee, have self-destruct mechanisms, just like you, as a student in front of a math test, have self-destruct mechanisms. Well, you look for something that will cheer you up, that will re-energize you. Now, where do you find it? Well, it turns out that there's a flock of 200 to 500 total nonconformist bees. And while everybody else has been working hard, these nonconformist bees have been totally indulging themselves. They've been going out and flying 8 miles a day, which is the equivalent in bee terms of flying from L.A. to New York and back. And they've been doing lazy figure eights and just bumbling around, following their whims. And some of them have found new flower patches. So those that have found new flower patches, they're not the wastrels that they seem to be. They are the searcher bees. Mm-hmm. And 4 or 5 of them come back to the hive and start advertising the flower patches that they found. And they advertise it by doing a little figure eight dance. Now, some bees will dance for as little as 27 seconds, and some bees will dance for as long as 27 minutes. There's a competition between the 5 bees, and they demonstrate their enthusiasm with how long they dance.
Wow.
And the longer they dance, what you remember, you're an unemployed bee. You're depressed. You're hit by your self-destruct mechanisms. So if your attention is caught by one of these bees, you begin to follow her with your antennae touching her body while she does her little figure-8 dance. And if she enthuses you sufficiently, if she pulls you out of your lethargy and self-destruct state sufficiently, she has given you instructions on exactly how to get to the flower patch she's advertising with the code of her little figure-8 dance. So you go out to the patch that she's advertising and check it out. And if it enthuses you, you go back to the hive and you dance with the bee from whom you got the information. Well, of the 5 bees competing with different flower patches, the one who gets the greatest number of backup dancers wins. Then the whole hive does what it did with the last hot flower patch. It all goes off en masse with everybody being a nice conformist and plunders the hot flower patch of the day. That's how the beehive makes up its mind. And you're built in exactly the same way. When you feel useless and others are ignoring you, you go into an internal state that sabotages you, a state that biologically sabotages you, with depression, with your immune system lowering so that you are more susceptible to disease, with the inability to do normal things, with depression, with interior pain, until you run across somebody who's got a handle on things and you can join up with that person and get excited about life again.
Well, Howard,
how can you tell when the bees are excited and when they're not excited? As they start coming in with empty pockets and they get no attention from the unloader bees, their temperature goes down. When they get excited by following a dancer, their temperature goes back up again. You can read the excitement or lack of excitement in a bee. You can read the self-destruct mechanisms in a bee by taking its temperature.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if we kind of take a more broader look into humans, I mean, we see that cortisol levels are extremely high when it comes to depression, and they become debilitating.
Right.
Now, the same or the opposite would be true with people that gravitate toward other leaders that you've looked at, including despots like Hitler. Talk to me a little more about that when you were looking into him, and what made people gravitate so much towards someone like him? What made him such a profound figure?
Okay, so the year of the Holocaust was 1943. That's the year I was born. So when I was a child, Hitler awareness was all over the place. And one of the most remarkable things that Hitler did were his torchlight parades. And in his torchlight parades, it would be 10 o'clock at night. There would be 10,000 soldiers marching down the Unter den Linden, I think it is, the major boulevard in Berlin. People would carry their children on their shoulders and crowd out to see the torchlight parade. And what Hitler did was he used the ecstatic experience. He told the people that there was Ein Führer, Ein Reich, Ein Volk, and Ein Führer. And people watching these soldiers carrying torches down the street felt exalted. They felt lifted into something bigger than themselves. They felt that they were a part of one state, Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, one people, one, what would you call it, one state, and one leader. And that sense of exaltation is absolutely necessary to humans. We need to feel a part of something bigger than ourselves. If we don't feel a part of something bigger than ourselves, we don't have a sense of meaning. And we are desperate for meaning. Well, think of this in beehive terms. The bees all they know is their personal experience and the experience of those around them. They don't know the overall state of the hive, but they are part of a hive with a distinct personality. And that hive's way of doing things and way of decision-making makes all the difference in the world. Because if the hive makes wrong decisions and has a bad year, it may not gather the 45 pounds of honey that are necessary to make it through the winter. It only gets 6 weeks in which to gather all of the material that carries it through the rest of the year. But if it's doing well, it will hive off, and half the bees will leave, and try to find a new home, and will establish a new hive. And if it's really successful, it will go through that hiving process 2 or 3 times in a hive. So what's the real business of a hive? It's to make new hives.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's successful, it can make many new hives. Well, the German people who felt an exaltation, a lift up to the level of something bigger than themselves. They were sensing what your cells would sense if they were able to feel what it is to be a Brett or what it is to be a Dan.
Mm-hmm.
When we feel caught up in something bigger than ourselves, we get a glimpse for a minute of the larger whole of which we're parts. We get a glimpse of the superorganism in which we're cells and of its own personality, its group personality. It lasts a very short time. It doesn't happen to us very often in our lives, but it's the source of meaning. And Hitler was brilliant at giving this kind of sense of being a part of something bigger than yourself and having a higher meaning. And now if Hitler could do it, and he did it for evil, then surely those of us who are out for good must learn to do it too.
Well, right. Yeah. No, definitely. Now, there's a movie being made about your life. Tell me about it.
2. Well, one is called Surf the Catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
They spent about 2.5 years making it. It's a 70-minute documentary. They started to work on it very shortly after Donald Trump won the election on November 6th of 2016, because everybody was in a state of utter devastation who loathed Donald Trump. And Charlie Hoxie, who has won 3 Emmys, heard about my philosophy from one of his colleagues. That is, I've taken, I was stuck in a bed for 15 years. I took advantage of that. For 5 years, I was too weak to speak and too weak to have another person in the room with me. I took advantage of that. It wasn't easy. My self-destruct mechanisms were going off like crazy. But I founded 2 international scientific groups on the internet, and I wrote 3 books. And so basically my philosophy is every catastrophe is an opportunity waiting to be discovered or waiting to be invented. Mm-hmm. So Charlie felt that was the philosophy we were going to need to make it through the Trump era. And so the film is now basically finished, and they're waiting for their first festival acceptance. And the producer is Brick TV, which is a prestige Brooklyn arts organization.
Okay.
And the other film is supposed to be shot, I think, on the 26th of June, something like that. I have to have my calendar in front of me. And it's a My Dinner with Andre style film. And if you haven't seen My Dinner with Andre, it's a movie whose premise sounds utterly boring. You're sitting down for dinner with this guy who turns out to be absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And you're glued to every word. So the maker of this film feels that he can sit down with me for a couple of hours and do the same thing, and that's his plan. And his film, he wants to come out in April of 2020, when Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll comes out. So we will see, and we'll see what happens with these 2 films. So that's it. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has ever had 2 documentaries made about them almost simultaneously, and the documentary's coming out in conjunction with a book. So it should be news. I mean, my publicist's brain says that it should be news, and we'll see.
Well, you foiled my plans. Now I got to make a documentary about 3 documentaries about me now. So.
Yeah, right.
Well, there is another documentary maker who's been tempted to do that, but his experience is that once you have somebody making a film about somebody, it's very hard to raise money. In fact, it's impossible in his view to raise money to make a 3rd film. So we'll see. Now,
one thing I don't want to forget here, you talked about your chronic fatigue syndrome, and at least back then, not a lot was known about it. Tell me more about it and how you persevered through that.
Well, it was 1988, and it was a tough year for me in the Howard Bloom Organization, Ltd. I had a competitor who was offering the same services that we provided, but at half the price. Mm-hmm. I suspect he was being subsidized in part to get me out of the business. because I was a danger. Look, the truth at any price, including the price of your life, especially when it came to finding the villain behind all the savage things the press did to Michael Jackson. I was dangerous to some people. But so it was a very tough year and a very stressful year. And I had a new client. It's the Womack and Womack. That's Linda Womack, who was Sam Cooke's daughter, and Cecil Womack, who, with his brother Bobby Womack, had written the Rolling Stones' first hit. And I, as you pointed out before, I insisted that if I was going to work with you, I get to spend a day with you in your own environment, trying to find the gods inside of you that made your music and that made you dance, that danced you on stage. So I headed down to, I think it was North Carolina or something like that, or West Virginia, where the Womacks had a great big unfinished aircraft hangar-like sized house, and, with a curved roof like an aircraft hangar. And I got down to wherever it was in Virginia. I got on, somebody picked me up in a Jeep. We drove for 5 hours into the countryside. We drove through a bunch of sheep on a hill, and up at the top of the hill was this huge house. It was March 10th. The house hadn't been finished. It had no heat. There was no furniture. We had to sit on the floor. And I got this absolutely fascinating story out of the Womacks. It turns out that there's a black coal mining culture in West Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee. I didn't know there were black coal miners. And what do the coal miners do to cheer themselves up and get a sense of unity, a sense of being a part of something bigger than yourself? When they're down in these dark and dreary mines, they sing gospel music. And they get so good at it that they're able to get into buses on Saturdays and bus to churches far away and perform their gospel all over the country. Well, that's the music, that's the culture that Sam Cooke came out of. Some people in the gospel movement will cross over and do pop. Now, the people in the gospel movement hate those people. They hate them as turncoats. They hate them as people who've abandoned their gospel roots and who've done something horrible and secular with music to go after girlfriends and groupies. And so Sam Cooke was hated in that way. It was a fascinating story to me. And I took the 5-hour drive back to the plane and got on the plane and used my little TRS-101, the first laptop computer, and organized my notes and got off the plane and went home. Then when I got home, I discovered I'd done something unusual. I had left my laptop on the plane. And Saturday, this was a Friday, and Saturday I began to feel a cold coming on. But my approach to a cold was work straight through it and do your normal 2.5-mile walk a day. I shudder to think that in those days I only walk 2.5 miles. These days I walk closer to 5 miles. But so I powered my way through the cold. Sunday the cold got worse, and I powered my way through it again. And Monday I got into the office, and I can't remember Monday at all because I was losing strength. And Tuesday I got into the office, and I was losing strength so fast that I realized that if I was going to climb up the stairs to my own apartment, they were going to have to get me home real fast. So 2 of my staff members, one got under my right armpit and the other got under my left armpit, and they dragged me to the elevator and down, and they threw me into a car service car, and the car service car schlepped me out to Brooklyn, and I used my last ounces of energy and walked up the stairs on my house. My apartment's on the 4th floor, and I spent the next 3 months in bed. And I was so weak that my brain shut off. I mean, normally you have dissatisfactions and you kick yourself in the ass for various things, and there are all kinds of things that drive you, and you're driven insane by boredom, and none of that happened. I was so weak that I just lay there and could stare at the ceiling and could be perfectly content. I've never been in that state before in my life. I've never been in it since, thank God. So that was the beginning of chronic fatigue syndrome, and I ended up in bed from 1988 until 2003. 15 friggin' goddamn years.
Fuck.
And it took 3 years. For 3 years, I struggled to get to my front room every day, and I sat at my office chair where I was accustomed to working, because work is my life, for as much time as I could. Some days it was only 17 minutes. Some days I managed to work myself up to 8 or 9 hours. And then a thought hit me. I was taking my energy, and of which I had very little, and using it to try to sit up. I was too weak to talk. I couldn't say a single syllable. And I thought, what if I lay down and do my work? So I don't tax the energy of my body by trying to sit up. And sure enough, when I lay down, my voice began to come back. But the only way to pull this off was to get two computers. In those days, two entire computers had less brain power than your cell phone. So I had two computers set up next to my bed and controlled by a single monitor and a single keyboard, using a little Chinese gizmo that lets you do that. Mm-hmm. And I went to work on the Internet. And over the course of 3 years, I was stripped of everything that I'd ever known as human. And I didn't even know I had a sense of being human. But when it disappeared, boy, I ached for a sense of humanity. And what do I mean? When you've had certain implicit goals all your life, and they linger there in your mind, and they're there as your future. Well, my future, I wanted to write books, and I wanted to take my wife out on the road with me, and I wanted to do every morning TV show and every newspaper to promote my books, and I wanted to be able to stay in Hyatt hotels because I love the yellow sheets, and I wanted to be able to take my wife out on walks with me through whatever city we were in, and that was my future as far as I was concerned. Mm-hmm. Well, I could no longer walk. I could no longer talk. All of that was stripped from me. I had no future anymore, none. And my sense of humanity utterly disappeared. So it took me 3 years to construct a new sense of humanity based on something new called the Internet. Mm-hmm. Actually, it wasn't that new. It had been around for 20, God knows, or 18 years. And I'd been on it since 1983 for 5 years. But it was on the Internet that I developed a whole new life, a whole new personality, a whole new set of friends, a whole new set of activities, and the Internet kept me alive. And in a sense, that was an advantage because most of the people my age or even 20 years or 30 years younger, mm-hmm. the Internet came to them relatively late in their life. I was reborn on the Internet. It is as if I was reborn in 1988, 1991. And I'm a child of the Internet. The Internet is a vital part of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Internet kind of hooks into something that I remember you writing about how, almost humanity needs to have some comfort and some socialization in order to survive.
We need connection. I mean, when we don't have connection, our immune system goes into low operation, which means mm-hmm. it opens us to disease. Our cognitive system shuts down. We have a hard time thinking. And the self-destruct mechanisms that we were talking about kick in.
Right.
So we need human connection, and the Internet gives us connection like we never had before. And those people who criticize kids for sitting at a dinner table and wangling and woodling on their iPhones are just a little bit crazy. No, kids should not be doing that during dinner when they have a chance to have face-to-face encounters. None of us should be doing it at dinner when we have face-to-face encounters. But in fact, what the Internet does is it connects us to so many people in so many ways that we never have before that it's beyond belief.
Yeah, I think the Internet... sorry, Brett. No, you're fine. Howard, I was going to say the Internet is really kind of an interesting thing because, I mean, yeah, we really are connected, and I do think the benefits outweigh the good. But sometimes it seems like you can have all the friends in the world and maybe, have a house full of people, but yet be the most disconnected and feel homeless at the same time.
That's true, and that's your self-destruct mechanisms at work. And how to overcome that, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I had to work out a suite, a complex of 30 drugs in order to get myself out of bed. And I don't mean that I could have gotten up and walked at any point. Mm-hmm. I just didn't feel like it. No, I could not have gotten up and walked. And with the 30 drugs, I'm now doing 800 push-ups a day. I did 800 this morning. And I'm walking close to 5 miles a day and doing all kinds of other exercises and all kinds of other extreme things. And one of those drugs is oxytocin. Well, oxytocin is a bonding hormone. Mm-hmm. Oxytocin brings us close to other people. And I swear that in the years since roughly 2000, when I began using oxytocin, I've become more social. I used to feel alienated and isolated among crowds of people who sometimes actually loved me. And I don't feel that way anymore. I used to, when somebody told me their name, I blocked it off immediately, as if it were a hostile incoming missile. When somebody throws a baseball to me, I don't know how to catch it, so all I do is stick up my hands in front of my face to keep from having my nose broken. And that's how I responded to incoming names from people. Now I embrace those names, and people swear that I know more names of people at the Chocolateria, the cafe where I work, than anybody else in the place. And I think the oxytocin, aging may have something to do with it, because you do mellow with age. There's a lot of scientific evidence on that. But oxytocin opens you up. It helps you bond with your fellow human being. Wait, are you still there?
No, I'm here.
Okay, there was a beeping on the telephone.
I was going to say that you found one of the doctors. Was it through somebody that was recommended to you? How did you find the doctor that helped you through that?
I started reading newsletters. The newsletter that came out of the CFS newsletter, the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome newsletter that came out of Boston, was really, really, really helpful.
Okay.
And I had the names thanks to that newsletter, of New York City doctors who dealt with chronic fatigue syndrome, and one of them would only accept you if you came into her office. Well, I couldn't get out of my bedroom except to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
There was no way I could go to her office. And if I had tried it, it would have been a huge mistake, because when you overtax yourself and you have CFS, you get so much worse that you wouldn't believe it. So, and my wife, I had a wife for 34 years. She left me because of the illness eventually. But my wife managed to talk another CFS doctor into coming out to visit me, do a house call. He was coming out to Brooklyn to go to a party, and she convinced him to come out on his way to the party, and he did. And he's been my doctor ever since, though he's now in retirement. He's still very important in my life, because it was what he did that saved me. And what he did was give me the email address of another one of his patients.
There you go. Okay.
And the two of us went out online, like Hansel and Gretel in the forest, looking for treatments for CFS. And that's how we found oxytocin. So I would find the treatment. I'd have a gut instinctual response on whether it might work or not. She would go find the doctor who had invented the use of it for CFS and get his protocol, his way of using it. And then we'd go back to our doctor, all of this on the internet, because I couldn't go in to see my doctor. We'd email him, and we'd beg him to give us this, whatever it was, oxytocin in one case, Cudipressin in another case. Cudipressin turned out not to work and not to be useful. Oxytocin turned out to be very helpful. And he would sit on it for 6 months. Well, when you're ill, if you're really sick and you're desperate to get back to normal, 6 months is forever.
Yeah.
But he'd sit on it for 6 months until he could regurgitate it as his own idea, and then he'd give me the prescription for it. My friend in Texas, the one he put me in touch with, unfortunately didn't try these things. I did. And some worked, like oxytocin, and some, like Cudipressin, despite all the hype, did not work.
How is your friend now?
I don't know how she is. We haven't been in touch for years. She eventually was diagnosed as having Lyme disease, and yeah, and for Lyme disease they do something radically different than for CFS. They give you these antibiotic treatments, really heavy-duty antibiotic intravenous treatments. So she was getting those, and they destroyed her.
Really?
And then they put her on methadone, and it turns out methadone is 15 times more addictive than heroin.
Yeah.
So she had a terrible time, and she's a really good and decent person, and she was certainly of tremendous value to me.
Wow.
But I should check up on her and find out how she is.
Yeah, I mean...
I also, oh, sorry.
Dan,
I also heard you admit, you keep running into each other.
No,
yeah.
Go ahead. You heard me admit.
Oh, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned that you had gotten married when, I don't know if I'm assuming you had one wife at that point, but she had a 5-year-old daughter. I was going to ask you if you had any kids.
No, my kids are my books. My kids are my ideas. I raised my first wife's 5-year-old. Then when my first wife left me after 34 years, 6 years into the illness, I went on the internet and found another wife, and she came complete with a 10-year-old son who had never had a father. His biological father would have nothing to do with him because she got pregnant. He was a married man, and she got pregnant deliberately, and she swore that he knew about it, but I'm sure he didn't, knowing her. And then she started suing him to pay child support. And because she was so vicious to him, he wanted nothing to do with this child that he didn't think was his. So Walter, my son, had never had a father before, and he welcomed me as a father, which was terrific. But no, my real commitment is to my books and to my ideas. When I was 10 years old, I was saved by two guys who had been dead for 350 years and reached out across those 350 years and caught me before I could fall. Those were Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek. So my obligation is to write books that will catch the next kid 350 years from now before he falls.
Yeah, isn't that amazing how a book can do that to somebody?
Yep.
I mean,
absolutely. And so I get letters. I keep a little file in case I'm depressed, and it's a file of positive things people have said to me, because when I'm depressed, I can't remember any positives at all. And theoretically, I can look at this file and cheer myself up. I've never looked at it when I'm depressed. Never. But it's now about 500 pages long. And the average email says, I was confused, and I was hopeless, and I was in a state of depression, and you picked me up, and you saved me, and you changed my life. Well, that's what I write for.
Yeah, definitely.
And, you can never guarantee that you're going to achieve the effect that you want, but apparently, judging from this 500 pages of testimonials, apparently that's what the books function as sometimes.
Well, Howard, I will say one thing. You've had a profound impact on my life and many, many others, and through your writings and just everything you've done. I mean, when you talk about multifaceted, Howard, you are just the epitome of that, man. I mean...
I created this field called omnology, and it's for those who are omnivorously curious. Omniscience, those who aspire to omniscience. What's omniscience? Knowing everything. Right. Who's omniscient? Allegedly God. Well, there is no God. So it's our obligation to become as omniscient as possible. And omnology is there so that when you're in your sophomore year of college and your dad sits you down and says, now, what do you want to be? And you say, well, I'm interested in art history, I'm interested in neuroscience, and I'm interested in film. And your dad says, let's get serious. You got to make up your mind. Are you going to be an art historian, or are you going to be a neuroscientist, or are you going to be a filmmaker? Until you make up your mind, you are nothing. And omnology is there so that you can give your father a great big fuck you sign and say, no, I have 3 curiosities.
Right.
Those are the sources of my passion. I'm going to follow those 3 curiosities for the rest of my life as long as they remain passions in me. And when I'm 40 years old and all my friends are having midlife crises and they don't know why they're on planet Earth, and the women are planning elaborate divorces in order to find out who they are finally, and the men are buying sports cars and picking up blondes and cheating on their wives because they have no idea of why they're on planet Earth, I will just be coming back with the first fruits of my multiple curiosities.
Yeah.
And I will, my friends will be at what they feel is the end of their lives. I will be at the very beginning of mine. That's omnology.
Well, I tell you what, it really is a fuck you, because society does give us this this false dichotomy. It seems like either we have to do this or we have to do that. And, you can get into that career field, but, you can't do anything else because... you've got tenure to worry about down the road, and you really need to stick with it. But, I mean...
Well, this is why I have very deliberately published in as many fields as I can. I have either published or given lectures at scholarly conferences on quantum physics, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, information science, cosmology, and I'm leaving some out. But that has been very deliberate, and I ache when I cannot write a paper or make a statement that is taken seriously in a new field. Right now, I'm so heavily involved in space that it's clouding out my ability to do other things. I mean, I was at Maxwell Air Force Base about a month ago, and it was a symposium of a bunch of us who'd flown in from all over the country, space activists, and two of the guys who'd written the textbooks on space strategy for the Air Force, and a four-star Air Force general. And I listened and listened and listened and took what they said and put it together in a simple $2 billion moon program. And now the general, I tried to hand the leadership of this $2 billion moon program project over to the general, and he kept handing it back to me. Now, admittedly, this general and I have been thrown together for the last 4 years on a number of occasions, and a year ago, out of the blue, he wrote me a letter saying you were a peerless leader. And to get that from a general whose whole business is leadership literally makes your whole physical system shock. So at any rate, now the two of us are partnered on this, and we went to Washington 3 weeks ago or so and met with the staff of a Democratic congresswoman, and we met with Newt Gingrich and a guy named Bob Walker, who's a former congressman who's very into space, and we're going to go back down for, I believe, another trip to Washington, and I gave the general the job of getting us to Mike Pence, because Mike Pence is the only one who can make a decision about this kind of thing. Although I suspect that one of the people on this team thinks that Wilbur Ross may be able to make a decision on this too. We'll see.
Well, you had talked about there being a science military complex.
Oh God, it's horrible.
Is it that bad?
Yes, it's cheating us. Right now, the space military industrial complex has created something it calls a rocket. It calls the Space Launch System, otherwise known as the SLS. It's created a capsule called the Orion, and it's creating a new thing called the Lunar Gateway. And these are great ways to spend huge amounts of money, to just slosh money into the pockets of the SMIC, the Space Military Industrial Complex Corporation, and keep us forever leading in space again. If the Chinese had designed the system, they couldn't have done it more diabolically. The Space Launch System is going to cost about $30 billion altogether, and will cost between $1 and $2 billion per flight. Now, let's look at this in a little context. Elon Musk has developed the Falcon Heavy. Developing the Falcon Heavy, which is a huge rocket. It's the biggest rocket currently operating on planet Earth. And he's developed that for less than $1 billion. And the SMIC, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin are developing, mostly Boeing in this case, are developing this fucking rocket for $30 billion. With Elon Musk, you could develop 30 entirely new vehicles for that much money. And
my Lord, that's wasteful.
Right, and for the price of one launch of the Space Launch System, assuming it ever flies, and it hasn't. It was supposed to be in flight by 2015. I don't know if you noticed, but 2015 was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And if it ever flies, for the cost of just one flight of this thing, that's Franken-rocket, you can buy 22 launches of the Falcon Heavy. Well, 22 launches is 2 space programs, one for the moon and one for Mars. The Falcon Heavy, remember, it launched a little red Tesla Roadster to Mars. It's not going to land on Mars, but it's going to reach Mars orbit. So,
where do you see reform in this?
What's that?
Well, I mean, where do you see reform? Does it come from the private industry, or does it come...
Well, private industry is the only thing that is allowing us to maintain our leadership in space. The manned space program people at NASA are traitors. They are turncoats. They are stabbing us in the back. They are making sure that the Chinese will do what they say they want to do and colonize the moon before we can get there. I had a friend who had been in a high position at NASA and has retired and went back to visit his NASA colleagues at a very high level, and they told him, if you think we're ever going to let you set foot on the moon, you got another thing coming. Because the Orion capsule, it's just a repeat of the 1969 space capsule. That's all it is. It's a big tin can. And it cannot, they're saying that it's going to be the basis for a moon program and a Mars program. It cannot land on the moon. It cannot land on Mars. It can only land on Earth using parachutes. Plus, it can never take people to Mars because it's too small. You go crazy. being in a tin can this tiny size for 4 months to 6 months.
Yeah.
So this whole thing is a scam. It's a con. And when Jim Bridenstine was appointed by Donald Trump as administrator of NASA, we all thought, okay, this guy's going to clearly see that he's got to switch to the private space program and just forget the SMIC. Well, he didn't. He's been captured by the SMIC. The other SMIC program is their Lunar Gateway. Well, what's the Lunar Gateway? It is this little tiny space station circling the moon that will only be inhabited by humans from 2 weeks to 2 months a year, and that's useless. It's worse than useless because they will then require that all rockets going to the moon not go to the moon. They will require that all rockets going to the moon go to the Gateway in order to justify the Gateway's fucking existence.
Yeah.
But we can go straight to the moon. We have Jeff Bezos announced his moon program the day after I came up with this $2 billion moon program. And Elon Musk is thoroughly prepared to take his vehicles and create versions of them that can land on the moon. And Elon Musk has a track record of actually flying things.
Yeah.
In fact, he's had 70 flights so far. So, meantime, at the military level, the SMIC has got the military all tied up. There are 34 launches coming up. They're letting out contracts for them, and they've built the order for what they want in such a way as to make sure SpaceX is not there. Now, look, if they buy their rocket launches, those 34 launches from the Space Military Industrial Complex, a company called ULA, United Launch Alliance, is the Space Military Industrial Complex placeholder in this particular regime area. If they do that, it's going to cost them approximately $500 million, $500 million per flight.
Wow.
Do you know how much a flight costs on a Falcon Heavy? It's
I have no
between
idea.
$70 million and $110 million. In other words, for the price of one launch with ULA, United Launch Alliance, the SMIC company, you can buy, wait, I lost track of my arithmetic. You can buy 5 launches from SpaceX. 5 launches from SpaceX. Eventually, this is going to funnel $18 billion to $32 billion into the pockets of the Space Military Industrial Complex, by keeping us out of space. You know, we haven't had manned access to space since 2011. Well, blame the SMIC, the Space Military Industrial Complex, and blame a guy named Richard Shelby, who's a senator from Alabama, who makes sure that these giant pork programs that parade themselves as space programs, but aren't, stay in existence because they pour money and jobs into his state, Alabama.
Yeah.
So those are the archdemons of space. The SMIC is what Buzz Aldrin, who's been a friend of mine for 15 years, calls the Darth Vaders of space. And Richard Shelby is the Lucifer of space.
Well, I did not know how deep the space military industry went until today. Well, that sounds like a humongous waste of money.
It's a humongous waste of money, but they get away with it by using providers for various parts of their vehicles in 49 out of the 50 states. And that means that 49 senators and congressmen are going to stand behind them in order to maintain jobs in their own district.
Yeah.
It's diabolical.
Yeah, I mean, you just, and you would think that there would be, some congressmen, conservative in nature, trying to lead the march against that, or even Democrat. I mean,
no one
it would
dares.
just seem...
Even the major space organizations have been captured. The Planetary Society is SLS, Space Launch System, all the way. That's outrageous.
Yeah.
The group I belong to, the National Space Society, will not make public statements on the Space Launch System. I run a group called the Space Development Steering Committee that Buzz Aldrin conned me into starting 15 years ago. We're the only ones who speak out because I don't give a shit.
Good. Well, someone has to. Well, Howard, I tell you what, we are very thankful that you came on the podcast, and it really has been a great insight for me, and Dan, I'm sure equally as well. Dan?
Yeah, I feel as though that my world has been open to. I mean, you are an amazing individual, and I can't even. I don't think I would ever measure up to a quarter of your life.
Well, if anything I can do, you can do better.
Well,
just like that, remember that Roger Bannister thing. He broke the 4-minute mile, and then it opened the way for one individual after another to break the 4-minute mile. And that's why I've established Omnology. I'm hoping to set new boundaries for what you believe you can achieve. And believe me, you put yourself to them, and you will achieve them.
You hear that, everybody? Keep your mind on the prize, and it can be multiple prizes. And the more you work at something,
persist.
Indeed. Well, thank you again, Howard. And this has been
thank you.
An episode of the Junto Podcast. And have a good night, everybody.